Okay, welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge, and I'm the convener of this webinar series for the International Social Capital Association. Our mission is simple. We want to both build the research and the practical application of social capital, and we've been running this webinar series since at least 2020, bringing people together from around the world to share ideas and build connections. And if you'd like to be part of the community, you're always welcome to become a member, and we're holding a big international conference in Dubai in next March. Hey, I'm delighted to introduce Graham Hall for a presentation entitled Emotional Intelligence as Infrastructure, Designing Cultures that Scale Social Capital. I'm especially excited about this session because our speaker, Graham Hall, brings a unique blend of experience and insight. Graham is an organizational development systems strategist and former VP of People and Business Operations. For over 12 years, he has worked right at the crossroads of psychology and system design and high growth tech. What makes his work stand out is how he designs human-centered, emotionally intelligent systems that don't just fix performance gaps, but actually turn them into lasting cultural strengths. His approach has led to some incredible results: near zero turnover, huge increases in engagement, and staff staying far longer, all because systems are designed around people and trust and emotional intelligence. So today, Graham is going to share how emotional intelligence isn't just a personal trait. It can actually be built into organizations as infrastructure, creating cultures that scale social capital and help teams to thrive. So welcome, Graham, and over to you for the presentation.
Thank you, Tristan. Yeah, a bit dry that, but I'll work on it. But I think I think it does an okay job. And as you know, this is my first time running this one. So this is a new talk I'm debuting. So I feel a tiny bit like a comic trying out a new stand-up routine. And I'm excited because the problem's real, the approach is sound and novel to many organizations. And I know everyone here and everyone watching the recording later is going to find ways to relate and springboard off it, which honestly just gives me a lot of gratification. That's kind of the plot. So let's get into it. You're going to be my clicker, so click away. Okay. So this is a big topic. We don't really have a lot of time, so I just want to jump in right in with you all at the top of the funnel, and we're going to work our way down this hierarchy a bit today. You see on the slide, and is in the presentation title. Most of our discussion today is going to focus around that organizational level, and we'll be connecting research and knowledge primarily across applied psychology and neuroscience, which is kind of my academic background, as well as organizational psychology, behavioral economics, and system design. And just by the way, if you want citations to anything you see here today, it's not my thing to throw a bunch of that on the screen, so just follow up with me after and I can send you anything you're looking at. So go ahead and give it a click again there, Tristan. So in various capacities, this is the breakdown of the broader economic climate across much of the first world and the overarching influences on today's business climate. And you can scan it, you don't need to read it all. But in a nutshell, what we're looking at right now is systemically, organizations are experiencing a lot of financial tightening, large chunks of talent turnover and retirement, and needing to develop newly skilled and resilient workforces that can flex and rise to these macroeconomic challenges. So if that sounds about right to everyone, we'll move to the next slide. So if these are the challenges being presented again at the top of the funnel, how are we as an organizational readers responding? So if there's time at the end, I'd love to come back to you all and ground some of this in your collective realities. But for now, here's what I hear most often in working with clients is I hear desire for organizational ideals like lean, adaptable, agile, innovative, resilient workforces. And then when exploring the roots of those ideals, organizations will talk most often about surviving volatility, like kind of the economic environment we find ourselves in right now, improving margins and keeping their talent engaged and motivated throughout. And when looking at how most organizations then are actually investing to pursue these outcomes, you often get a lot of emphasis on typical first reaction strategies. These are things like headcount reduction, process efficiencies, restructuring hierarchies, and upskilling talent. So again, if there's time at the end, I'd like to kind of revisit that all with you. But for now, just I want you all to take it all in and ask yourselves this kind of one question I have here on the board. Do you feel these strategies solve the problem at hand? And if you're open, I'll give everyone a minute just to see what starts popping up in the chat because this is the part I'm kind of most interested in. I know economics is not everyone's game. It's like barely mine. My grandfather was quite an economist, actually, once upon a time. But anyone want to try a stab? All right, Tristan, let's move a slide. Okay, so regardless of what you guys were thinking behind the scenes there, my answer is yes. It's a yes and. So, yes, strategies like headcount reduction, org restructuring, and investing in processes and technological efficiencies can address immediate pressures. They can, and they do. And they are also pretty reliable at breathing new life into performance risks. These are things like large-scale disengagement, distress, resistance, burnout, voluntary turnover. These outcomes are real. We can measure it. And when you're in it, you can really feel it. Okay. And I call these stick strategies just to kind of simplify it. And stick strategies achieve outcomes through things like resource withdrawal, imposing control and constraints, and pervasive signaling of punishment cues like fear, obligation, guilt, and shame. Okay. And when organizations lean too heavily on these strategies, as many do, research shows that we obtain desired short-term outcomes. So that's that yes, but at the cost of performance and cultural instability and large financial investments to rebuild them, which absolutely hemorrhages human capital ROI over the long run. So that sucks. Okay. Rather, as organizations implement sticks and organizational disruption accelerates, herein lies one of the highest ROI opportunities on our human capital in both de-risking emerging destructive performance patterns and creating sustainable cultural norms that persist in spite of the sticks we implement. And we do that with what I just call carrot strategies, which achieve outcomes through satisfying survival concerns, engaging intrinsic motivations, and conditioning pervasive trust and safety. And it's usually via positive reinforcement. And when organizations take an approach like this, so they're balancing short-term stick with future-oriented carrot strategies, again, research shows really measurable improvements in learning, adaptability, collaboration, commitment, resilience within your core teams. All qualities critical to developing the lean, sustainable, high-performance environments that we just described is kind of the aim here in the previous slides, despite the macroeconomic climate we're in. So again, if our through line here is a more balanced investment in what we're calling carrots, our mission then is to discern how to continually embed these core elements into the operating models and business strategies of our organizations. Click again, Tristan. So enter social capital and emotional intelligence. These are two of our most effective entry points to this work. So there's a lot of research I can ramble about here, but I'm going to keep it pretty brief today because so this is because EQ and social capital Together, they're effective at building internal and interpersonal trust. So EQ is linked with greater self-awareness, comfort with vulnerability, while social capital reinforces reciprocity, psychological safety, and together they lay the groundwork for stronger trust and relational bonds. Are effective and have efficacy in enabling collaboration and innovation. So they improve knowledge sharing, conflict navigation, creative problem solving under uncertainty. Together, they mutually reinforce and compound over time. This means emotional intelligence is really good at creating the interpersonal conditions, relational norms, and trust needed in a system. And social capital is really good at strengthening them by creating reinforcing loops through networks and systems. And together, they drive adaptability and sustain performance. Again, kind of coming back to the top of what this is all about. So, organizations that invest in EQ and social capital are more resilient during disruption and better at retaining and engaging talent and sustaining high performance. Let's cook again. So this is where we're going to start narrowing today in on EQ a little bit. So the dominant concept of emotional intelligence and its benefits has been continued developed in corporate environments for about the past 25 years or so. So it's really not new. And as contemporary work continues to become more human and human, and emotional labor and work continues to increase over the past couple decades, there's been an increasing demand for EQ skills. So in 2025, over 75% of Fortune 500 companies considered emotional intelligence as essential in leadership. And high IQ leaders consistently outperform their peers, reduce employee turnover by about 50%, and boost team productivity by about 25%. So all things any organization would want more of. In response, corporate investment to develop EQ skills across leadership and workforce has skyrocketed, right? But despite spending thousands of employees each year on EQ and QQ related skills, these initiatives rarely deliver lasting behavior change. Gains are really typically short-lived. They're hard to scale. They're inconsistent across teams, right? Particularly when the workforce is large. So to date, fewer than 20% of large US companies have succeeded in fully integrating EQ at an organizational level. So what's the problem? I have a couple answers for you guys. Let's click again. First, the way EQ is conceptualized, educated on, and mobilized in corporate America resembles characteristics more of the sticks we talked about earlier than the carrots. So it's typically predicated around managing or controlling emotions rather than processing emotions. Whenever I hear EQ training and in the first sentence they talk about managing emotions, it's an easy toss away. But when we manage emotions, often through skill development in emotional regulation, we are attempting to influence which emotions we feel when we feel them and how we express them. And in corporate American culture, our organizational norms often reduce emotional regulation, which is that core skill being taught, to dissociation and suppression of perceived negative emotions, which just perpetuates an unintegrated brain state that is survival and narrow focused, meaning when our physiological responses are become highly triggered, and our heart's going ba 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 ba, we are more adept and we are taught more often to push them down and away rather than moving through them. Okay. And as that managing rhetoric has become more standardized and chronic suppression and impression management creates emotional distance and it's dissociation, we've seen a lot of haphazard outcomes in EQ development. Okay. Research across org psychology and neuroscience shows that these patterns regularly lead to less capacity for continual engagement, more regular kind of boom bust cycles in our engagement, in our capacities, decreases in innovative thinking and future planning. That's because when our heart's going ba 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 and we're just pushing it aside, it's really hard to kind of look in the future and outside of this narrow present focus. decreases in long-term commitment and relationship building. I'm not so concerned about hanging out with Tristan or seeing what he wants if I'm going blah 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 and I can't get through that. Okay, lower performance and productivity input. Again, we're distracted, right? We're pushing it away. We're saving it for later, but it's still there. It still has an effect. It's still draining our batteries. So alternatively, when EQ development more closely resembles contemporary applied psychology and neuroscience, which means focusing on processing emotions. We learn how to experience, metabolize, and integrate emotions as they arise. It's really important. Most emotions can really be effectively processed in like under 2 minutes. It doesn't take a long time. And in doing so, that enables us to quickly return to our work, again, with an integrated brain state, so grounded, rather than acting from a fight, flight, freeze, fawn, survival response in perpetuity. So when we make this shift in EQ development, not only does this generate an inverse effect to the list you see there, approaching EQ in this way stimulates new opportunities to build collective trust and safety, further perpetuating social capital development in a network. And the reality is that in much of today's knowledge and service-based work, employees don't see or touch the outcome of their efforts the way they would in tangible output roles. So think about like a baker making like a loaf of bread. So this has really created a growing gap in our perceived impact and our satisfaction, motivation, our work. Okay. So the result of that has been in the last couple of decades, employees seek to close that feedback loop increasingly through other means. So emotional satisfaction. That means furthering our relationships, novelty and collaboration, and expansion of our social capital as substitutes for satisfaction and tangible output. And we need to be able to effectively process emotions to do this at scale. We need. Next slide. The second challenge kind of rings true of the title of this presentation, which is that EQ development in corporate environments is too often approached at the individual levels. This is most often it's things like coaching and workshops or upskilling programs and courses. I spoke with a colleague like a month ago, and his first reaction to hearing me do this talk is to shoot me an EQ course that looks like it was a video shot of the 90s. And again, first thing on it is talking about managing. So this is how most of us have experienced EQ training. However, the trouble with even well-designed programs in this space is relatively the same. They're really effective at inspiring temporarily. They are, but they rarely create any lasting change. And that's what we're talking about here. The momentum fades after a blip in time. It goes like this. Okay. People get a little spike of something, but it doesn't stick, or it cycles in and out with a few key company stakeholders who come and go, right? It's because most EQ and people skill training in general is delivered to our conscious mind, okay, where deliberate attention and effort occur, but considerably less programming power resides over our behavioral and emotional patterns, okay? Conversely, organizational systems, policy, infrastructure that's already embedded into our daily rhythms and routines, they're already shaping these patterns far more effectively. And that's because where we place attention, how we interact, and what emotions we feel safe in expressing are more readily impressed to us through our automatic unconscious processes that our environments pattern within our subconscious, okay? So it's a whole different part of our brain, right? So whether intentional or not, our organizational systems are already continuously conditioning how our people relate to each other, how they respond to each other, and how they show up at work. Okay. So the key questions for us as organizations and as leaders is, do we even know what we're conditioning into our people through our infrastructure? And do we know how our structures are shaping or eroding our people's capacity to engage, perform, emote, connect, to be and do more? So when EQ is treated as critical infrastructure rather than an individual add-on, EQ becomes like a systemic lens for discerning and diagnosing these performance issues. It moves from the individual to the structural, and it culturally compounds over time to the benefit of both our people and our bottom lines. Again, there's lots out there that would tell you that, but if we go back to the beginning, traditional EQ training, it has value. Okay. It really does. It lays that groundwork. It sparks awareness. It gives us that blip, right? It gives us a quick fire. But research in neuroscience and organizational learning, again, they're consistently showing that the lasting EQ development requires reinforcement through systems, norms, strategies of the business. So when we stop viewing EQ as an individual trait and start viewing it as a lens, right, for how systems shape behavior, it becomes a diagnostic tool for culture. And that's how I've used it. And you see where trust is breaking down, where safety is absent, where collaboration is blocked, or where social capital is being eroded, not because people lack the skills, because the structure isn't supporting them there. It's incredibly hard to force engagement with EQ or anything, but the idea here is that we can design the infrastructure to make it possible. Let's go next slide. Okay, no presentation would be good without kind of a couple case studies. So let's look at that. Let's look at that infrastructure design. So as of today, infrastructure design to develop organizational EQ is pretty novel. Okay, people framing it through that lens, not so common at this point. However, the concept of developing desired skills and norms by reinforcement through organizational infrastructure, that's less so. And when we see across industries is the same pattern, okay? When organizations deliberately bake people practices into their infrastructure, the results are sustainable, 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 not the blip. So take Microsoft. Some of you may have heard this one. It's from about a decade ago when Satya Nadella became CEO in 2014. Microsoft at the time, I think they characterize it as it's pretty stagnant. It's risk averse, lots of internal rivalries, plagued by silos. So one of Nadella's answers at the time was to reorient the company around what he called a growth mindset culture. Okay. And he was focused on embedding that mindset shift into critical infrastructure. So they pinpointed leader evaluations, promotion criteria, and performance systems redesigned to reward learning, collaboration, and cross-unit behaviors rather than just individual output. Over the next 5 years, Microsoft's market cap roughly tripled in doing this. Internal sentiment measures and engagement indicators improved, and greater cross-unit collaboration supported faster, more innovative product cycles in their cloud services businesses. Okay, here's another. 2012, Google set out to understand why some teams consistently outperformed others despite having access to similar talent and resources. They called this Project Aristotle. They studied over 180 teams, and what they discovered, strongest predictor of effectiveness was psychological safety. And that's over 10 years ago. Today, this is backed by more current research that demonstrates a team of even moderately skilled employees can outperform a team of highly skilled staff when supported and reinforced by an effective set of norms and routines, i.e., infrastructure. And that's exactly what Google did, though, at the time. They embedded psychological safety into team operations, hiring practices, and feedback systems to hardwire behaviors like open dialogue, risk-taking, and equal voice. And those practices really took hold. Teams with high psychological safety showed greater innovation, faster problem solving, and stronger attention. So when we look at these two big examples, right, the framework for success is here. Microsoft embedded a growth mindset by redesigning learning, collaboration, and performance systems. Google embedded psychological safety by redesigning operations like hiring and feedback systems. So again, let's take just the obvious next step here. How could we embed EQ by redesigning these same infrastructure components? And that's what I want to cover with you guys as we kind of wind down here a little bit. Go ahead and click there, Tristan. Thank you. Um, so let's take that Microsoft example and kind of try to mimic where they're focused. Okay, so most organizations still run on outdated operating systems, just like Microsoft at the time. Okay, they're vertical, fragmented, highly controlled, and reward individual effort over collective outcomes. And the results are usually pretty kind of somewhat predictable. It's low psychological safety, guarded communication, siloed echo chambers that stifle collaboration, learning, innovation, right? So this means when change or disruption hits, a new strategy, market shift, or major technical change like AI is doing right now, these systems will lag and they'll fracture. So most often you'll see organizations start to duplicate effort, they'll lose speed, and they'll really bleed talent, time, trust, money. And they do it often while over-indexing on rigid job descriptions they think they need in external hiring. So what this means is organizations are responding by paying for capabilities they already employ, demotivating the people they already have, and hindering their potential for systemic and financial success. And the truth is, people can achieve much, much more with their existing skills, talents, and interests than most of our organizations and systems enable them to. EQ-based infrastructure can help unlock that capability and capacity, embedding continual pathways to build internal and external trust, develop intrinsic motivations for engagement, again, kind of leaning back on those carrots that we talked at the beginning, and create more strategically aligned collaboration norms. So I'll give you an example on this one from my own work. This was at a SaaS company, and they were navigating a major market pivot where seasoned staff and high performers began to become silent or siloed, resistant, and disengaged, and turnover risk had started to climb. So instead of replacing the talent, we and turning over, right? We redesigned infrastructure to embed EQ into how work was structured and rewarded. And we did that. It's three major shifts that kind of anchored that change. The first is what I'm going to call point to as agile role realignment and planning. So we conducted one-on-one audits that surfaced things like motivations, adaptive patterns, network supports, emotional strengths, alongside technical skills. And we redeploy people from legacy roles from that into new growth areas that reduce ambiguity and overlap while preserving engagement and trust. And we're able to reinforce belonging and safety during that disruptive time. Second major shift I'll refer to as transparent priorities and recognitions. We implemented what we call a networked first organizational framework where shared dashboards and weekly 10 halls gave visibility to critical projects and team objectives across the company. Okay. So this did things like normalizing openness and reducing confusion and fear. And then we had things like peer recognition and retooled performance systems where we rewarded talent contributions outside traditional roles towards the current ongoing organizational goals. So we created new incentives for norms in empathy, curiosity, social capital expansion. Okay. The third thing we did is what I'll refer to as cross-functional collaboration and mobility, which again it echoes kind of what the Microsoft example they did there as well with cross-unit behaviors is what they called that. But we created structured time for cross-team projects. We created an internal growth marketplace, which provided contribution learning and relational development opportunities. And this enabled staff to follow renewed intrinsic motivation and cultivate a sense of psychological ownership and autonomy in their career. So on the slide there, I listed some of the results at the bottom, but the point I want to hit here is moving EQ from an individual trait to a function that's reinforced and conditioned by our systems, right? I got one more example for you, and then we'll kind of wrap up. So this is one I haven't, in all transparency, this is one I haven't done, but I've thought about a lot, and I'm wondering how many of you will relate to. The first one is anchored in reality. The second one is anchored in adjacent fields, let's call them. But this is around hiring and evaluation, just like the Google one was focused on. So today, most of our hiring systems unintentionally, I would say, condition the stick expression of emotional intelligence, let's say. So if you think about standardized behavioral interviews, they're mostly set up to reward performance, polish, controlled effect, and they do a pretty poor job at surfacing things like emotional and relational data and insights, transferable character traits, and just human complexity. So in screening for presentation over potential, strong candidates, routinely move through the process unheard, unnoticed, or misread. And I feel like probably everyone has a story where they can relate to that at some point in time, feeling like they're a good fit for the role, but not feeling safe to show up in the ways they'd want to, and not feeling like the person really understands how they're showing up. Um, so leadership roles, for example, now take on average, I think about 3 to 6 months to fill, in part because both candidates and hiring managers are really structurally changed to manage impressions, just like I talked about. They're avoiding vulnerability, they're minimizing the relational risk. And the result is a conditioned pattern of mistrust, misalignment, self-protection before the role is even filled. You know, the kind of dirty little secret here is like we're not running out of talent, we're missing it, and we miss it frequently. Alternatively, okay, an effective EQ-based hiring infrastructure here could refine processes to cultivate connection and discernment within an organizational framework. So we're not abandoning the organizational framework, we're adding on to it, we're refining it. Okay, for example, hiring managers may borrow processes from psychotherapy. Okay, therapists are grounded in shared frameworks, just like a hiring manager would be grounded in a shared organizational framework and hiring system. But therapists are empowered to follow nuance. They're trained to do that, right? They're trained to follow and read emotional cues and context in real time. They can play with the conversation that's happening, and they know how to dig around in it and find what they're after. This is because the reason therapy is structured like this is because there's over decades of research that show the quality of the client therapist relationship, so that what's happening in that room is the strongest predictor of successful outcomes. So the same logic may apply to hiring. You know, a lot of my work involves taking from these adjacent fields and recontextualizing it. The same can be done here. When managers are equipped to build rapport, like quick emotional rapport, they can surface capability, motivation, character with far greater fidelity than scripted questioning allows them to, right? And so again, it's not moving out of the organizational system, but it's making refinements to it that support the individual. So similarly, if the hiring evaluation systems are to mirror and reward curiosity, vulnerability, emotional connection alongside capability, the process shifts from performance management to a relational assessment. And the tandem conditions stronger emotional trust and safety throughout the hiring experience then. And that really sets the stage for stronger engagement, collaboration, and retention before onboarding is even set to begin. That one's a passion project. One day, perhaps. So if you could flip one more time. Okay. I know Tristan introduced me a little bit at the start, which was nice. But at this point, you may be wondering a little bit more about me. So to wrap up here and just kind of tie a bow on this, I'm an OD and talent strategy consultant. I have an academic background in applied psychology and psychotherapy, and I'm going on about 12 years now working at the intersection of again applied psychology, emerging business technology, systems design. I've done a lot of different types of work in tech, SaaS, AI. These are my industries. I started in startup and growth environments, and then more recently, I've consulted with some large enterprises like Microsoft, AWS. But today, through my consulting practice, I focus on helping what I call lean, high growth companies address systemic performance issues by embedding human-centered solutions like emotional intelligence into their daily workflows and infrastructure. It's all about the systems. That's where we can get the biggest bang for buck. That's where someone like me as a consultant can be there for a minute and think, hey, something I did will actually stick, okay, and not just fill a budget for a point in time. But beyond that, I do it because I know a fundamental truth that I'm sure some of you can relate to. Uh, People and profits are not at odds with one another. And people like companies are continually adaptive, fluid, changeable beings. And when they feel grounded and safe, people want to lean in, people want to learn, people want to give an F about what they're doing and who they're doing it with. And when this happens in perpetuity, many of the metrics and outcomes organization care about, they just tend to move in the right direction. Okay. And we can measure them all to death, but they do. And so this stuff is really pretty simple. But the environments and norms we condition to our people, they have real impacts on both their professional and personal lives. So it's important we get it right, or we at least try to think about it. So if we could flip one more time. That's pretty much where we're going to wrap up today. I know today was short, but I'm looking forward in the remaining time we have just to read some of the comments, toss the ball with you guys, have a discussion about anything you saw here. And Tristan, now that you're probably turning your mic back on. Thank you to you for hosting this and providing a platform for me to take my first run at pulling all these thoughts that I've had and all this work I've been doing that's been sitting in my head over the last couple of years and pulling into something I can show people.
Great. Thanks very much, Graham. Very interesting, and there has been a bit of chat in the Zoom chat as well. So we've got some time for some questions and some discussion. Feel free to either raise your hand, which you'll find under the React button within Zoom, or alternatively, you can post in the chat. And when we come to you, if you could unmute yourself to ask your question. But of course, if you're not in a position to do that because of a noisy environment or any other reason, just let me know in the chat, and I'll be happy to read out the question on your behalf. So we'll go to I think the what's going on in the chat first, and then we'll
Yeah,
see
catch
if
me
we
up.
can how we can go from there. I see that Jonathan has a hand up, so we'll get to that shortly. In the chat, Stephanie brought up the difference between meaning of work compared to meaning in work compared to meaning at work. Um, and and I think it's not commonly thought about in this way, but if you think about it, social capital really is about meeting social needs. All capital meets some kind of need. Physical capital meets physical needs and human capital and so forth. And social capital really is about meeting social needs. And so when we think about an act like cooperation, working with a team member, then we could cooperate because we're paid to do so, or we could cooperate because of coercion or threat, like those sticks that you're talking about. Or we could cooperate because we actually want to, because it meets social needs, because we feel good when we do so. We feel a sense of belonging, or we feel external validation, or we feel, like it meets our ideal self. So all sorts of social needs might be met. And clearly that's what social capital is all about. But like you said, we're always just too focused on the stick and the transaction that is involved in you should work together because we pay you to do so. Well, that's actually not a very good motivation because you'll pay me anyway, even if I don't
Right.
work together very cooperatively with my teammates.
Right. Yeah, there's lots of things you can pull from here, but I mean, most of it is, when you say it, most of it is pretty commonsensical. I mean, uh, a lot of research will show, again, I kind of mentioned it as survival needs. But once you meet people's what they conceive as a survival need, they have enough. You keep throwing more benefits and money at people, it's pretty diminishing returns after a certain point. So the question then becomes, what else can we do here to get people to lean in? What else would they enjoy to get them to lean in? Because performance in my mind is mostly about, it's not all about engagement, but a large part is just about engagement and getting people to rev themselves up and firing that curiosity and interest in developing the work in front of them, and again, the relationships around them. And the kind of thing I said at the end, when those things happen in perpetuity, which is hard to do, that's why the systems and infrastructure design is important. Most of the stuff we tend to care about as far as organizational outcomes or strategy just starts tending to go in the right direction. So,
Yeah, and it can be difficult to communicate that to people who aren't used to thinking about it. They're used to thinking just purely about we pay you a salary, therefore you need to work. That's the transaction. Why aren't you doing it? And why aren't you doing it better? And so it can be difficult to try and communicate that. One of the ways that I've done it, and talked about this, is that you might employ someone six figures for their human capital, the fantastic skills and abilities and experience that they have, and you bring them into your organization, you pay them a lot of money. But if they can't work together effectively with others, then that human capital isn't being activated. It isn't being
Right.
enhanced and transformed, and it isn't actually fulfilling the needs of your organization as much as it could be. And so you're literally
Yeah.
wasting money here. It's not
Yeah.
efficient. It's not productive as much as it could be. And that kind of messaging I've found, people pay attention to that. People's ears prick up and they're like, oh, hang on a second.
Okay.
This comes down
For
to
sure.
money in the end. Maybe we should pay
Sure.
attention to this.
I mean, I always got to, I mean, in this type of work, you always have to just come back to the bottom line and what's being affected there. But what you're saying is basically exactly that Aristotle project I mentioned from Google, and a lot of research that's come out since that. Again, it says mediocre skilled employees who are assessed to have mediocre skill and technical skills, right? They can outperform the ones who are full of high performers, right? And it comes down to relational norms and expectations in the space. It's the infrastructure that's supporting them and being reconditioned throughout the process, right? So it's exactly to your point.
Yeah, we could talk about this all day, but let's see. Jonathan, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, thanks Tristan for hosting and Graham for the presentation. Really interesting stuff. So appreciate you guys hosting the session. I had a question in relation to kind of the work environment. So, fully remote, hybrid, fully in person. Do those environments change how we think about establishing these systems and infrastructure, or do kind of the same plays work regardless of the environment? Is there much distinction there between say fully remote versus fully in person?
It's a good question. It's kind of like how, again, I'm pulling a lot from applied psychology, psychotherapy, some organizational psychology, but it's kind of like uh, no one person's the same, no organization's the same. So it is a bit case to case. But what I will say is, a lot of people, if you're enhancing, say, EQ skills, right, and we're developing those or social capital, a lot of people are pretty fixated on how that needs to look and where that takes place. And same thing in adjacent fields like therapy, okay? They all had to go online too at some point, right? But does the efficacy of the work change that much? Not really. I mean, and there's more and more studies coming out that kind of say that's become got a lot more resources allocated to in the last few years. But when we move again from it being so individualized and it's something conditioned through the structure, it can be as simple as norms and expectations set up in your Slack chat or how you operate with a system that you and your team collaborate through every day, and that happens remotely or in person. So a lot of times, the more stringent I find reliance on systems, the more likely we can use them to condition things because people are relying on them more versus the quote unquote water cooler talks that kind of are more Wild West, let's say.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good point. So questions has come up in the chat from Matt. Feel free to unmute yourself and pose your question if you're in a position to do so. Otherwise, I'll be happy to read it out on your behalf. Okay, great. I'll read it on your behalf. So he says, may have missed it in the beginning. Biggest challenge with integrating these concepts into a work culture is how owners, leaders, and staff feel overwhelmed with all these things they already have to do, and all the things they're trying to implement. How would you respond to this feedback from someone who may intellectually agree with this content, but not see how it can be implemented in a realistic or practical way?
Well, it's a good question, Matt. Usually the way this works is when you're talking about touching big pieces like this, so infrastructure and deriving them around things that people may not think about as regularly, right? I think I said at one point, our systems are already conditioning things into people whether we mean to or not. So let's be intentional here, right? Um, but um, a lot of times, what will happen is because they're such big pieces, you'll start with a very specific entry point. Like right now, a lot of my work is around AI something something, AI transformation. But what that is an entry point into structurally designing and embedding new norms of operation across the company. And so again, a lot of times people may intellectually, like you say, relate to this and not know where to start. And so taking things like that, which are already have budgets and already have a bit of momentum and saying, we don't need to knock down the whole house and redesign it. But let's start like touching these little pieces you're already touching. And in this time, have a little more intentionality in what we're doing with them, and then measure that and see what the practical measurable outcomes are of that. Okay, so let's solve a real problem with budgets that are already available. And as we do that, that opens that conversation up. The second thing I will note too here is, um, as a consultant, when people come to you, they have a usually an immediate problem they're trying to solve, and then they sometimes will kind of word vomit a larger, broader problem that they said, "Well, you're in here, maybe you could touch on this, this, and this." Okay, and so sometimes it's in the this, and this. You're doing it, but ultimately it comes down to a few key stakeholders who are willing to play ball with you. And if they're not, right, or if you give them a solution they think they want and it doesn't meet how they would think of it or how they would go about it, then usually what happens is you get in these battles of escalating kind of emotional defensiveness. And most consultants will go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, trying to meet the skewing kind of demands that's being asked for. It's kind of engaging that cognitive mind. But, again, my background is applied psychology, psychotherapy. So a lot of what I try to do is turn on a therapist hat. And usually what's happening is there's an emotional kind of thorn, as they like to say, that's pricking there. And I like to try to pull it out that's keeping them from being resistant in the moment. And so, again, few ways to look at this depending on the situation, but it's a good question.
It is a great question, and it comes to how stuck in our ways we tend to be. Most organizations think about things in that kind of transactional way. They're used to doing things for decades in that kind of way. And so even though they acknowledge the importance of these things, it's still a shift to then make it a priority. And it might seem almost rude to suggest that that's what it is, a lack of priority, but like when you really appreciate how important these things are, then they become a necessity. And I think we understand this for physical capital. If you've got a machine and it's not quite working and the motor's wearing out, you need to take it offline, or you need to put some investment into fixing that motor in order for the machine to continue to function and for it to continue to function better. So I think we understand the priorities for physical capital, but maybe we don't understand the priorities quite so much for the social capital. And so maybe it's as blunt as that. We need to really understand why it's important, and then maybe we can prioritize it within the systems that we're working in.
Right, right. I like this.
But
I like this quote that John got. That's got a few thumbs here. And it's kind of like painting infrastructure is kind of like the floor we're all standing on, and we can reach for these heights. But like what it's characterizing infrastructure supports the common floor that we'll all bounce to, in reaching for those. And so where are we bouncing from a little bit is how I read that.
yeah, it's certainly a great quote. For anyone who doesn't have access to the chat, it's you do not rise to the level of your goals, you fall to the level of your systems. I think that's exactly kind of the point that you're making here, is that we need to take the time to develop those systems, and those systems have meaning for people, and then their meaning, of course, shapes the nature of their actions in the workplace, which has profound consequences for the organization.
Right.
It's a question there from Jean. I'll read it out on your behalf, but feel free to. Oh, it looks like you're unmuting yourself. Feel free to read it yourself.
Oh, hey. So Graham so Graham and I kind of know each other. As you know, my focus is certainly in consulting, dealing with business leaders who are really only focused on kind of both the cost and productivity enhancement areas of performance management, right? So you're talking about rebuilding infrastructure, right, and building social capital, and it takes time and steps and effort and intentionality. So do you have, and I know the Project Aristotle has some really, I'm familiar with that, and it has some really good kind of metrics around it. But in your practice, do you have kind of once you reach kind of this penetration, right, or these steps, you can expect these kind of improvements in whatever metrics you are looking through, throughput, quality, cost avoidance, because that ends up being a key selling point for change for most leaders. Because most of this is good. Like I mean, we're probably all like-minded. I understand it. I think it's important. But at the end of the day, most people I deal with don't have a very broad, they're narrowly focused, right, on the tasks and business and quarterly profits at hand. And so there needs to be something that tickles their interest, like, hey, next quarter, I'm going to have 3% better sales than I normally would, or something along those lines, or my defects are going to go down, or whatever. So,
Right. Right. No, I think that's the way. I mean, when kind of re-looking at it through that lens, I think kind of what I iterated at one point in the presentation is important. When we're thinking about, again, the subject here is EQ, but it can be any kind of people development type work, really. Um, you know, Traditional EQ training, right? It might give you that, I called it a blip, right? So and I had characterized problems with kind of most of the EQ training that's out there, not all of it. But even in the good courses, they'll give you that blip. People will get that spark of engagement. You'll get those measurable returns quickly. I think the point I'm trying to make and what I'm trying to make to the clients is after the blip, how do you keep that building and sustaining in perpetuity, right? And usually the metrics I point to are more around like KPI metrics they're interested in as far as financials. It's a lot of times we'll come back just to like that greater return on investment in human capital, basically. That's our biggest investment any company makes. But my consulting career is still somewhat young, and this is the part I think, like you and like most of us, where's what sizzle or what's the entry point to this type of work? Because again, I think, like you said, Gene, a lot of us see this as like commonsensical, but we're working with clients and organizations that you call are narrow kind of minded or narrow focused on the immediate, right? And so that's why I kind of mentioned things like AI transformation as an entry point. It doesn't, on the surface, it doesn't sound exactly what I'm talking about here, but it is an entry point to start playing with the systems and infrastructure, right? And they have active budgets for those things. And so what I do is try to look for waves that exist where we can start to tuck some of this in and be more intentional, right? Versus trying to uh, compete for metrics, but I feel like that's an area of growth still in my consulting experience at large. That's the hardest part, honestly. So
mm. So just a
you're
thought, because since you mentioned, and then I'll let other people kind of have their questions. But so you mentioned AI, or whether it's generative AI or agentic AI, as kind of an entry point. Maybe as part of your practice, what you may want to take a look at is actually the training models for agents and Gen AI to actually have the EI and EQ built in,
yeah,
kind of from the get-go.
yeah, for sure. I've done a
So
little bit of that work,
yeah.
not so much, but I've started to do a little bit of that, kind of working at that kind of system design, kind of
Mm-hmm.
um, engineering, prompt engineering kind of level, right? So, but it's a way, again, the idea is like, if I show up or anyone shows up, you're there for a minute in a point in time, and you want something that lasts, that conditions, that exists in some kind of perpetuity. And our ability for influence is super, 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 super small, especially when you're talking about big companies like Microsoft or AWS. And so something like any kind of infrastructure, but essentially, of course, AI, where it can re-imprint and recondition norms over a period of time. I mean, I did a project like this with AWS, which was essentially taking EQ training from a standardized approach to an AI model that would embroil standard routines and emotional intelligence into people by essentially teaching them what I call parts work, which is a therapeutic kind of modality, but giving people some way to continually develop that over time in spite of what they're doing as part of their daily rhythm, and then use what they're learning in that in their day-to-day interactions, right? And have some standardized language, have a common framework, right?
It's such an important topic, really, isn't it? And like, I think the way that I would describe it is there's often low-hanging fruit. There's often things that are very easy and tangible. They're kind of obvious, and you can make these very small changes that often cost nothing at all or very, very little, and they can have some fairly significant impacts on the nature of the social capital within an organization. And I think one useful way of thinking about this is that there's many aspects of an organization's processes, systems, policies, the way in which they do business and they carry out their activities that are negative. from a social capital point of view. They do damage to the nature of how people work together and their attitudes towards each other. And then there's things that are kind of indifferent, and then there's things that are already positive. And taking that approach where you can look at the strengths and the weaknesses and identify those opportunities and threats, like basically doing a SWOT analysis within the context of social capital, is a big opportunity, because quite often, like I said, there can be tiny little things to shift in the way in which an organization operates that can have quite a big impact. And so one of the challenges, like you mentioned, is, well, how do we identify what those things are? How do we implement a change or a fix to those things that's going to be effective and going to have lasting and long-term impact? Because it's not so much about what we do, it's about how these things are interpreted, what meaning they have. So even the best intentioned changes to systems and policies and procedures aren't necessarily interpreted as such, and can therefore maybe not have the positive impacts that we're looking for.
Right. Yeah, I think the point Gene's kind of putting a finger on there too is like most of the stuff when to most people and organizational leaders when when served kind of quickly their heads are going to go, that's a well-being thing, right? That's a well-being budget item, right? That's a nice to have for employees. That's not part of business strategy. That's not part of the organizational operating model. And to Gene's credit, the point he's trying to make is, we as a collective group can become better at tying these things to the organizational outcomes and financial outcomes so that then the changes we know and research will show will make a broad difference can now enter a whole different conversation and a whole different budget where it can really run. And it's not just a nice to have and throw a couple bucks at it. It's something that's really seen as essential and can move an organization in a big way.
I think that's a good point, because a lot of organizations, and they've said it to me, they've said, like, this isn't our business. Like, if our employees can't understand each other's emotions, if they can't work together, if they don't have great well-being, that's up to them. That's a personal issue for them to address. What's this got to do with us? And how could we even influence it anyway, is the kind of pushback that I've heard. But the thing is that when you point out to them that they literally create the enabling environment, the organization is the enabling environment where all social action within the organization occurs. They shape the nature of the space and the policies and the procedures and how people feel about the organization. That is all within the control of the organization. And so when people say, well, what's it got to do with us, and how can we actually influence it? I say, well, let's talk about that, because it's actually pretty significant.
Yeah, that's, at the top, I had that little funnel that went, systemic down to individual. And I think at some point I said something like it's really hard to force engagement with anything or learning or with development. But, the organization where it sits is that infrastructure level, those systems, those policies, those daily rhythms that we operate within. That's where it has that mode of influence. That's where it can play. It can play most effectively. So it's like we better be looking at everything through that lens because that's your greatest sphere of influence for both yourself and for the people, right?
Right. And lots of organizations understand this. You read the articles about Google creating physical workspaces that enable social interaction to occur. So we've known about this for a long time. We don't necessarily use the term social capital to describe it, but there is an acknowledgement of this. And there are plenty of people organizations whose work is literally creating those physical spaces that enable the kind of social interaction to occur. And it's not just about having, couches and desks or some gaming machines. It's about the aesthetics and the rules and the policies, and, the entire space on more than just the physical level is really what creates that enabling environment.
Yep, yep, yep. Yep. The norms we set, the policies we have for people to
Yeah.
work autonomously and reach outside their kind of immediate, and even things like I mean my favorite coffee shop, I work at coffee shops religiously. My favorite ones in Montreal, and I thought it was great because I met so many people there, and the only thing they were doing really well that I don't even think they understood they were doing well is the place was so small that all the tables were so cramped in side by side. It was almost awkward if you didn't speak to the person sitting next to you or the group sitting next to you. And so it kind of, even simple stuff like that, it kind of like removes the barrier to entry on extending and leaning in and creating that capital, right? And so
Right.
again, like something subtle. And in that case, I know they didn't understand that that's what they were doing, but it had an effect.
And sometimes it's accidental and sometimes it's just intuitive. I think we see it quite a lot of times. Really great environments are created, but they might not have been done so quite as deliberately as talking about social capital and emotional intelligence. But we intuitively understand they're important and quite often they're created anyway. But maybe with an understanding of social capital and EQ, maybe we can do it even better again because we can be quite purposeful and deliberate about the way we do things rather than just relying on intuition and I guess in some ways almost sheer chance and luck that we happen to put it together just exactly right to make things work.
Yeah. Have you, Tristan, have you brought these two, because your world is obviously social capital, right? And so have you brought emotional intelligence often? I know it's kind of a catch-all term. I use it as a catch-all term in many respects because it's one people in organizational settings are familiar with. Like I said, it's been around for almost 3 decades at this point in those circles. But is that one that you see kind of working in kind of symphony with what you're doing, or how have you seen this kind of contextually historically?
Yeah, it's absolutely fundamental to being able to build social capital. We often assume that everybody has the individual competencies, the skills, abilities to be able to build social relationships, but that's just not the case. Being able to build a really strong and meaningful relationship relies on emotional intelligence and a whole lot of other individual competencies as well, like effective listening and like there's so much that goes into building a relationship. And so I think whenever I'm working with an organization, it's about, well, look, you can create your systems and so forth, you can create space in the enabling environment. But you can't assume everybody has this ability. But fortunately, all of these skills and abilities can be improved. They can be trained. One of the questions I was going to ask you, I know there's still a question in the chat we'll get to in just a minute, but I wanted to ask you that one of the approaches we take is something kind of like social capital literacy, where the goal is to increase people's understanding of the importance and value of social relationships. And what we see when we do that is people just naturally shift their actions. They start to talk to people a little bit more. They start to be a little bit more trustworthy, a little bit more interested in others, reach out to people a little bit more often to maintain those relationships because they understand, they've reconnected with the value and importance of it. And so is that something that you see within the work you do, that you kind of need to build the general awareness, not just within leadership, but also just within the general workforce to actually appreciate, well, why are you building your emotional intelligence? Why are you building your social capital and actually understand the value of it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, but I would kind of reorient it a bit. Like in the presentation, I talked about like traditional trainings will give you that blip of awareness, right? And that blip of like momentum and maybe some skills to start playing with. Or if I look at my therapy practice as an example, like new clients come in, and a lot of times, unless they're already very emotionally intelligent, very self-aware, you are starting with psychoeducation around how to kind of look at yourself and pulling the pieces of their life together and showing the patterns a little bit, right? But inevitably, um, people will lean in when something is made their own. That's why I talked about intrinsic motivations, right? And so the thing that gets people to lean in is going to be uniquely their own. You can discern in themes across a large group of people and design for those. But inevitably, you're trying to create pathways for people to discover and then self-serve and lean in the ways that are important to them. And in doing that, have the guardrails, the infrastructure, and the pathways that then condition whatever we're trying to condition, in this case, emotional intelligence, into them. So yes, there's some level of, hey, if we increase the awareness, we talk about, we show the benefits. Yeah, there's a little blip there, but then that's not what sustaining power is about. It needs to be made their own. And again, when everything's about constraints and control, like in the stick kind of approaches I talked about, it's really hard to do because it's just, and what I tried to pull out in the hiring example is, yes, we can have organizational structure and standards of practice and work within it, and we can train people to use their own skills, interests, whatever in a moment and take advantage of them, right? And so it's that dichotomy, that balance, I think, is where you get kind of sustaining good impacts.
And there's a really strong theoretical argument for that as well. Like the work coming out of behavior change theory suggests that knowledge alone or understanding alone doesn't shift action, doesn't change behavior, that it really requires a shift in beliefs. And so I think that's exactly what you're talking about. Like as you were talking during your presentation, I made a note. Like it's about moving beyond the transactions and moving beyond just an intellectual understanding of why this is important and valuable, but actually shifting it in the belief about how it works in your life and how it relates, like you said, to you personally, not in some sort of abstract way to an organizational theory. And that requires kind of a deep level of engagement with it. Shifting belief doesn't tend to happen quickly, and it certainly requires that integration into the self in a way that is much more than just simply presenting some knowledge to people. Because I'm sure we've all seen, you talk at people for an hour, they go, yeah, that's great, that's really important. They walk away, and then maybe they just continue to do everything exactly the same as they did before.
Yeah, like, one of the examples talked about psychological safety, and let's use that here. I can enter an environment, I can enter a team, I can enter a workspace and have all the people tell me and all the things tell me I'm safe. But it doesn't matter if they tell me I'm safe and I don't feel safe. Those are two entirely different things. And that's why in part of the presentation, I tried to talk when we're talking about infrastructure, we're trying to work with the unconscious, the subconscious mind, right? And we're trying to work on an emotional level because even in the form of safety, there's entirely different forms of safety. Like in therapy, they'll use four different forms of safety that you need to feel and able to feel like you can trust someone. And when we're just focused on the cognitive or we're just focused on what it looks like on the outside, we're really, really, really missing the plot. We're working with like the very thinnest edge of the wedge, right? And so you're missing the plot. And again, a lot of these things are not novel. They're novel in this setting, but they are what a lot of them I'm pulling from is best practices and frameworks in adjacent fields, again, like applied psychology or any of the behavioral economics, right? A lot of times when we look at the organizational structures, how we work together, we're a couple decades behind. So I never feel like I have to reinvent the wheel or go off a whim. I'm just recontextualizing proven practices and research from these adjacent fields and saying, what would this look like in an organizational context? Because a lot of the work is moving, applied psychology is very focused on one-to-one or one to a small group, like a team. And so it's kind of taking that research and again saying, what would this look like if we could put it in an infrastructure level? And that's where I have to get a little creative, be a little creative and lean a bit more on my business acumen. But what I'm pulling from is sound. It's there and it's been there for a while.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. There's an absolute mountain of research going back 70, 80, 100 years. There's so much material there to draw upon, and that's can be part of the frustration I think sometimes with this work is that we know it. It's there's evidence there. There's theories and work across many different areas of the social sciences that support this, and yet still organizations like we've kind of been talking about can struggle to understand it, prioritize it, see how it fits into the bigger picture. But it's like it's there, it's important, and we just need communication. I guess ends up being the biggest challenge of how do we get people to go from what they have been doing, which I think most people would acknowledge is pretty ineffective, to then doing what we're talking about here, which can be much more effective and has good reason for it, but it's simply difficult to communicate reasons why.
Yeah, and that's why I like to pull from psychotherapy quite often because it's not just the research saying something, it's right in the name. It's the most applicable form of what's happening in the greater field. How can we make this real? How can we make this tangible? How can we move mountains with it? That's what's being done in psychotherapy or any form of applied psychology, right? They're taking that research and they're making it practical, okay? And then they're measuring those results. So those fields are already benefiting from all of this. And again, when it comes to a business setting, organizational setting, all of this stuff um, exists and existed for a while. We're just trying to catch up a little bit. We're just trying to catch up. But again, to Gene's point earlier, you need to funnel it through the bottom line and usually a few key performance indicators or outcomes that they're interested in. So, and that's
Yeah,
our challenge at work. So,
yeah, yeah, precisely. So the question in the chat from Asia, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask the question yourself. And Jonathan's also had a reply in there, so feel free to get involved. I'll read the question on your behalf, but feel free to get involved in the discussion about it. So the question is, in a professional, formal ecosystem, what are the most appropriate ways for employees to communicate with each other in order to maintain professionalism, using informal or polite soft language or strictly formal and firm language? Explain how strictly formal and firm communication supports the organization's professional identity.
So when we talk about emotional intelligence, a lot of times what we're doing is we're creating some self-awareness and we're unburdening parts of us that that mask or feel afraid to show up or have protective responses. And so what we're trying to do is create pathways and language for people to express vulnerability, basically, because a lot of people want emotional intimacy. They want to connect on these levels. And context is everything. And so in developing kind of that emotional understanding and that emotional intelligence, the idea is we're able to not only regulate and process, but the other part I didn't talk about is discern what's happening in a moment and then use your best judgment. But the idea is we want to move from a place of groundedness, not of, I called them punishment cues in an organizational context, but fear, obligation, guilt, shame, or anything that's triggering black and white, all or nothing thinking. That's when we're moving from a place where we can know we're not grounded, where we know we're triggered, where we know we're not um, in a place that's centered. And so that's how I would kind of respond to this and looking at what's appropriate. That's for you to decide. The context is everything, okay? And we're developing the muscle so that you can discern the context in front of you and make a choice for your system that both is engaging and feels safe in the moment, right?
And I think to Jonathan's point as well, in different forms of communication, internal and external and so forth, you might choose slightly different kinds of approaches. But I think also to your point, Graham, like there's enormous differences in the culture between individual organizations, and there's obviously enormous differences between the culture of different countries as well. So in some countries, the kind of level of informality that might be common in Australia, for example, where I live, might be completely inappropriate and maybe misinterpreted in other cultures as being rude even. So the context is absolutely important. And like you said, when you have that emotional intelligence and that awareness of it, then you can discern the context and make the appropriate sort of forms of communication.
Yeah. And again, in the hiring example, that's basically what I was pointing to, that what therapists do in real time every single day, and those skills are highly teachable. So it's kind of where can we embed them and where would it be best to embed them across a team or a workforce, right? And what kind of effects would those have?
Yeah, exactly. Right, so we've still got around about 8 or 9 minutes left, so feel free to get any final questions in if you have any. One thing I wanted to touch on, Graham, is that idea about the positive feedback loops, and I think it's a really important one because as a form of capital, social capital, when it's enacted in a positive way and it gets a positive outcome, of course, tends to reinforce that capital. It almost appreciates in value when it's used in a way that produces desirable results. And so we do tend to see those kind of positive feedback loops. And you're talking during the presentation about tapping into those kind of compounding effects and finding ways for those feedback loops to be maintained rather than the things in the organization that might undermine them or result in almost damage to them or stop them from occurring. So it'd be great if you could just elaborate a little bit more about that and the approaches that you might take to try and reinforce those kinds of loops.
So it depends on what piece we're playing with, I suppose. But if I refer to the example, I didn't put it here, but an example from my work with AWS. Um, it was basically around, like, again, creating a common framework of a language and ways people could understand themselves that would create that floor we talked about earlier, right? And then the feedback loop is coming from both the AI system, which is kind of continuing that self-discovering and learning, but also then encouraging that to be used in a real life setting. And again, having that be kind of conditioned there as well through people basically having a common language that's easy to relate to each other, have empathy, blah, blah, blah. And so the feedback loop can be, again, I think the way we discussed it earlier is a good way to think about it. It's where's the floor we're jumping off of, and then how high can we climb with that? Ideally, this becomes conditioned into people where they don't need the infrastructure to kind of create that feedback loop, but to reach its potential, infrastructure creates norms that then are used kind of in the real world, right? Where things really happen, where real meaning that feels palpable, I suppose. So
Yeah, great. So, are there any final thoughts you have, Graham? Anything that you feel like we've missed as we've gone along, maybe moved on too quickly from something, or something you'd like to reflect on?
not particularly. I just know it's a really big topic, and I know, I'm pulling from a bunch of different fields, and I know this is not commonplace. I mean, most of this stuff exists in an IO echo chamber of some sort, and really what I'm trying to do is both break that echo chamber a bit because there are some things that aren't working there, and I'm trying to pull from these really applied psychology fields where it is practically being used and getting practical results. And again, just trying to make the point of this is out there. What else could it look like if we upfeed this into the systems and organizations we spend, a third of our lives interacting or a third of our day interacting with, right? So I think that's really the point I'm trying to make, is just to open that idea, because I know the subject is big. I know the ideas are a little novel, and it's just a place for people to start.
Yeah, we've actually just got one question come in on the YouTube stream, so we've got time. We'll quickly get to that one. Andreas asks, maybe it's not quite your area of expertise, but he says, I'd like to hear your opinion on transferring these strategies, perhaps to city councils or communities, which may not be organizations or companies, but rather people outside of companies. Whether you have any thoughts on that?
No, I haven't done any work like that, but that's kind of where I'm interested in moving some of this more. So Andres, if you want to chat personally sometime, I think my links are in here. If not, maybe Tristan can grab and we can exchange information. But that's an area of interest that's very strong for me. And so if that's something we can collaborate over on, that's great.
And there's clearly a lot of overlap there, but it's just the hierarchical system often is obviously quite different, and so many of the same kinds of systems, rules, policies, procedures, environments are often still take place, but they're quite often the responsibility for them might be scattered across many different government departments, for example, or across many different kind of areas of control. But I think many of the same kinds of lessons apply, but it's just applied perhaps in a different kind of way. But it's a
Sure they
big
do.
topic for sure.
Yeah, they do. The roots are the same. The entry points are going to look different, and the conversations with the stakeholders, the leaders, they'll look a little different. But the root of what we're doing is the same, just like in any of these other fields we're pulling from. Like if say you're a performance psychologist, are you talking about generally anything that's really different from a trauma psychologist? Across a broad spectrum of clients, most of the time, no. The entry point of the conversation is different, but the roots are the same. It's the same here.
Well, let's end it there. There's so much more we could, of course, be talking about. Thanks very much, Graham, for your time and effort in putting this webinar together. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Appreciate you.
Feel free to stay online, anyone who wants to just have a little informal chat. Otherwise, if you need to move on to another meeting, we completely understand.